Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today we're going to be talking about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, what's going on there, and why the events of the Ukraine war are giving many European countries, Germany included, real second thoughts about the question of nuclear power going forward. Now, before I begin, I want to, just for the interest of exposing my own biases, I want to give my own view of nuclear power in this context, because I think it's always important to be able to identify where a given source or commentary is coming from. My view is that nuclear power has a number of significant problems with it. And these include the questions of disaster cleanup and how we pay for and plan for all of that. And I also think that the long-term waste disposal question is not as well solved as some people like to think. This being said, I also think that nuclear power, when you compare it with other forms of energy, ranks significantly better than coal. Coal is worse by literally every metric I can find, except for the issue of the possibility of a major disaster. So I'm actually less uncomfortable with building new power plants than I am with building new coal-fired plants. I'm less uncomfortable with keeping nuclear plants running than I am with keeping coal plants running. But coal is a really, really low standard here, right? Coal releases more ionizing radiation under, ideal circumstances than nuclear power plants do. Plus you have greenhouse gases, you have air pollution, and so long-term problems aren't any better with coal. In fact, in my view, they're generally worse. This being said, there are no perfect power options. Even hydroelectric, which ranks relatively high on the beneficial scale in my view, does bad things to ecosystems. So all energy has costs, and so my view is that conservation needs to be the first instinct, followed by questions of decentralization and creative reuse, things like methane digesters on dairy farms, for example, that can take manure and convert it into electricity and fertilizer. And in that particular case, you're talking about something with a net positive environmental impact. Being able to do methane digestion of what's really a pretty bad agricultural waste product would reduce the overall environmental impact of our dairy farms, for example. And then, somewhere down the line, where we haven't been able to get rid of the big centralized power plants, I think nuclear makes some sense. This being said, when I started talking with friends of mine who disagree with me, they've brought up some points that I hadn't thought about. And, obviously disagreement happens usually because, neither side's crazy. And those points have a certain degree of validity. And so I want to kind of bring them up here and how the conflict in Ukraine and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is really exposing some of these shortcomings of nuclear power. So, first, what's going on with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? We know that there's been shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There's been a lot of blame trading between Ukraine and Russia on this. I think virtually every analyst I've read suggests that the shelling is coming from the Ukrainian side. There's also been a lot of misinformation. There was a propaganda post published that where somebody in the Russian government purported to say that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was under scorched earth policy, and if Russia couldn't have it, nobody could. They were mining the area, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S.-aligned Institute for the Study of War flagged that as a hoax, but they said and they criticized the hoax particularly because it obscures many of the dangers that this particular nuclear power plant faces, being in the conflict zone. What we now have seen after that has been accusations of storing large amounts of weapons and things like that at the power plant itself. The evidence for that surfaced was fact-checked by the Telegram and found relatively wanting. Basically what they said is, we have some photos of some personnel carrying trucks. Maybe not best, but we have no evidence of weapons. We have no evidence of ammunition being stored at the site, etc. Now, obviously, I'm just going primarily here from the Western press here. Anyway, there are other aspects to this conflict also that that may be encouraging shelling of the plant, and that's kind of where I'm going to be going on this. But like Al Jazeera, which at this point I would, as far as the Ukraine conflict goes, is definitely a pro-Western source, has also said that they've interviewed people and that people have reported artillery shelling of Ukraine from near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Nobody specified where these are coming from or anything like that, and so it's very, 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 very hard to determine if this is basically what the validity of the claims are. Hard to tell even what the claims are in this case. Of course, if Russia is firing artillery shells from like next to the nuclear power reactors, that would be the same kind of thing as what Amnesty International is complaining about with Ukrainian troops firing from near hospitals, for example. You can't launch an attack from near a sensitive target without thinking carefully about what the return fire might do to that target. So, now moving on to the strategic aspects and what else is known. We also know that the Ukrainian armed forces have been shelling the hydroelectric dam near Kherson. Now, it's really important here to note that not all shelling of a dam is equal, right? If you're shelling a dam to try to breach and destroy it, that would be a war crime because the massive flooding that would kill lots of civilians would seem to be the obvious target. There's no evidence that Ukraine is trying to do that. Instead, what they seem to have done is they seem to have damaged some of the power generation capability in that dam. And this is going to become very important as I talk about like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as a whole. But it's worth noting that the hydroelectric dam near Kherson is at reduced capacity because of damage from shelling. Now, as I speak here, we're in August, we are nearing September, fairly soon we're going to be in winter, and two big things you have to understand is being able to supply electricity to the areas of Ukraine occupied by Russia requires some fairly large power plant generation capabilities. And so the two primary nuclear power plant, or the two primary power plants in that area are the Kherson hydroelectric dam and this Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. My understanding from third-party analysis sources is that Russia has been attempting to connect the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to the Russian grid. in order to make sure that this area can properly supply power. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me because I would think it would already be connected to the grid with Kherson and so forth on it. At any rate, I doubt that this kind of work would be done at the power plant itself. So I do have to wonder what the trucks are doing there. But moving on from there. Now, the thing is that what I think may be going on, in addition to any return fire and things like that, is that if Ukraine can deny power generation to the Russian-held areas, that's going to make it very, very, very hard for Russia to govern the areas that it's captured. And so I see the shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the hydroelectric dam in Kherson as being closely connected. And in my view, this is very similar to Ukraine cutting off water to Crimea in 2015 or whatever it was. Again, an attempt to try to economically cripple areas that they see as hostile and occupied, so that they'll become more difficult to govern. Now, the thing about the nuclear power plants in general is that they produce a very, very large amount of energy. Okay? Nuclear power is the most energy dense form of electrical generation that we currently have. And for this reason, there are a couple of considerations that have to go into it. The biggest one is cooling. We all remember, or those of us who were alive at the time remember Chernobyl. And the thing about Chernobyl is that was a cooling accident. Okay, it was human-induced, along with some design issues in the reactor, but it was a cooling accident. In other words, the fundamental problem was that the reactor overheated and produced a steam and later hydrogen explosion. So, even when you shut down a nuclear reactor, if you just simply shut it down, you still have to cool it. There's that much energy involved, right? And so, if you can't cool the reactor, you risk a massive disaster. What we saw in Fukushima, for example, was that the tsunami carried away the diesel tanks for the backup cooling system. So even though the reactor had been shut down, it still overheated, melted down, and led to this massive contamination. By the way, I must say that despite a lot of criticism that Japan's had over that, I think that their efforts of cleaning up have been what I would hope for, right? And Japan's goal is a total cleanup. In other words, no uninhabitable areas, nowhere where agriculture is off limits and things like that. And I think that is what we owe further generations when it comes to nuclear power. So, the shelling, I believe, is intended to create a situation, among other things. There may be other considerations also, but I think, among other things, it's probably intended to create a situation where Russia has to shut down the nuclear power plant. And since the Kherson hydro dam is already under reduced power generation capability, the goal would be to use that, the electrical power from Kherson would have to be used to cool the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That would leave very little electrical generation available for any of the rest of these occupied territories. Now, this gets at a really important piece of sort of the nuclear power discussion that's then happening in Europe. People here are rightly concerned that we're going to have another accidental release out of Zaporizhzhia due to this conflict. And while people here are less inclined to jump to conclusions about exactly what's going on, they are typically much more concerned about what this is teaching us about nuclear energy, because Chernobyl, of course, was human error, along with some design issues and some other things, right? Fukushima was a natural disaster. There may be some things we can do to make nuclear power plants hardened against those sorts of disasters. But Zaporizhzhia is an act of war, right? And consequently, you have the issue of human ingenuity being directed in a malicious way, right? And I want to specify here, I'm saying malicious in terms of directing against a power plant. I'm not necessarily trying to imply anything moral out of it. So in the event where you were to have, say, a major conflict in Europe, let's say another war between, say, France and Germany, then the power plants become suddenly really important strategic targets for military implications. Because if you can force your opponent to shut down the power plants, those power plants go from being net generators of energy to net consumers of energy. In other words, shutting down a nuclear power plant has a has an effect on your power generation capacity that is greater than the power generation that the nuclear power plant has itself. Like, if you shut down a coal plant, then, it's not generating electricity. You might need some form of electricity to get it going again, but you're not in a position where you have to supply electricity to it to keep it in a safe shutdown state. But with nuclear power, very oftentimes you have to do that. And so what you find is that the thing that's really rattled a lot of people here is they say, coal may be better nuclear may be better in all these metrics, but if I shut down a coal plant, it's shut down. If I shut down a nuclear power plant, it's not shut down. It is now a consumer of energy. So you have to supply that energy from somewhere, and now suddenly it becomes an energy liability instead of an energy producer. I have to admit I hadn't really thought about that. So that's something that's causing me to rethink some of my own positions on nuclear power generally. This is this puts nuclear power in a section where it creates a vulnerability to war in a way that is systematic to nuclear power itself. If we were doing everything with very small, say, modular nuclear reactors, it might be different because maybe they're small enough that there could be some passive cooling capability. But the fact that you have this active cooling dependency, even in a shutdown state, is something which makes nuclear power a direct liability in the case of armed conflict, not just from the possibility of being bombed and having stuff released, but in terms of the risk management decisions that then you have to make. So what can be done about this, and what can we encourage to be done about this? One option would be like a treaty similar to similar to the Geneva Conventions that we could generally agree to be defining international standards of conduct during war. And we could conclude that nuclear power plants need to be off limits for this sort of thing. The problem then is, what do you do if somebody breaks it? What if they are shelling you from your nuclear power plant? What do you do at that point? Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. Another thing is, we could accept that this is a fundamental risk and therefore declare all power generation, attacks on power generation, to be off limits as in the context of war. I don't see the Americans agreeing to that, right? I don't see the Russians agreeing to that. I don't know about the Chinese. I don't know about the Indians. I think many other countries might. And if you get enough countries to say this is something that has to be the case, then maybe there's a way of pushing sort of the major world powers at this point to sign on. But, we've got to figure something out, right? Because coal is terrible. There is no worse power generation technology than coal. Wind and so forth can help a lot, but we don't have an immediate replacement here. We have a long way to go before we're able to really build solar infrastructure in a way that's completely sustainable. Hydro dams, of course, have their problems. Nuclear has its problems. But if these events are pushing people towards coal, then we're creating bigger environmental problems than we'd like to think we're solving. So we need to figure out a solution to it, and we need to be engaged with others on finding a solution and in pushing, trying to build momentum for, in my view, international agreements to, in my view, probably to exclude all electrical generation facilities from attack. And yes, frankly, that would probably include windmills. So that's all I have for you today. Hope you have a great day, and talk to you soon.